The night of December 29th, 1916. The basement of a mansion on the Moika River in St. Petersburg. A man sits at a table eating pastries laced with cyanide and drinking poisoned wine. And nothing happens. The poison doesn't work, so they shoot him. He falls, and a few minutes later, gets up and runs across the courtyard. They shoot him again and again. By some accounts, he was still breathing when they threw him through the ice of the Malaya Nevka River. The killers were not hired hands, not random conspirators. They were members of the empire's highest aristocracy, a prince connected to the Tsar's own household and several others from the inner circle. People who had everything: money, titles, entire armies of servants. And yet they decided the only way to stop this man was to arrange a private execution in their own basement rather than a public trial.
Ask yourself the question right now, in the first minute of this video. What does it take to get inside the minds of the most powerful people in a vast empire so thoroughly that this is the decision they arrive at? This is not a scene from a horror film. These are the final minutes of a man who, 10 years earlier, had been an illiterate Siberian peasant and had become the one person capable of dictating decisions to the last emperor of Russia. His name was Grigory Rasputin, and today's video is not about mysticism, not about magic, not about the mad monk of tabloid legend. Today, we are going to break down, step by step, 5 specific psychological mechanisms, the ones a single man used with no formal education and no official lever of power to gain control over the mind of an empress. And the same mechanisms that are still working today, just in different settings.
This is not a story about an evil genius with a perfect plan. Rasputin was not a strategist in the Machiavellian mold. Most historians agree he acted more on instincts than calculation. But that is precisely what makes his case so valuable. It demonstrates you do not need a brilliant plan to get inside someone else's psychology. You need 5 things, and we will find all 5 in his story in chronological order, starting from the moment a barefoot peasant ended up in the same room as an empress. Watch for the moment each tactic appears for the first time. By the end of this video, you will have not just an interesting historical story, but a working map you can hold up against the people in your own life. One methodological point before we begin. We will rely only on what is documented in diaries, correspondence, and memoirs of contemporaries, courtiers, ministers, members of the imperial family itself. Where sources conflict, or where we are dealing with later legend rather than documented fact, I will say so explicitly. This is not a video about mysticism. It is a video about the mechanics of influence. Grigory was born around 1869 in the village of Pokrovskoye in the Tobolsk province, deep in Siberia. An ordinary peasant family, no education, a reputation in his youth as a man with a rough and volatile temper. By some accounts of his fellow villagers, he was involved in petty theft and widely regarded as someone to avoid. Keep that in mind. The future spiritual advisor to the Empress of all Russia began his path not as a meek ascetic, but as a man with a highly questionable reputation in his own village. The gap between who he was in Pokrovskoye and the version of himself he would present a few years later to the capital's highest society, that gap is not a coincidence. It is part of the same pattern. A successful manipulator almost never carries his past along when he can offer a new, more convenient version of himself to an audience that knows nothing of the old one. At some point, historians disagree on exactly when and why, he underwent a religious transformation. He began wandering between monasteries, calling himself a starets, a holy elder, though he was never officially a monk. The word wanderer deserves a pause. In pre-revolutionary Russia, there was an entire culture of such people. They walked for years between monasteries, lived on alms, and through this wandering acquired the aura of someone who had seen what settled, comfortable aristocrats had never seen. For the bored capital elite, such a person promised something real by his very presence, something untouched by protocol and the flattery of court life. By 1903 to 1905, he had made his way to St. Petersburg. And here begins the first important detail. High society at that moment was consumed by mysticism. Seances, wanderers, holy fools. It was fashionable among an aristocracy tired of the rational age. Rasputin did not appear in a vacuum. He appeared at the very moment there was a demand for him. This is the first lesson to hold in mind throughout this entire video. A manipulator rarely creates a need from nothing. He finds an existing hunger and is the first to feed it. In 1904, Emperor Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna finally welcomed their long-awaited son and heir, Alexei. And almost immediately, something terrible becomes clear. The boy has hemophilia, a rare genetic disorder in which blood does not clot. Any bruise, any fall, could end in death from internal bleeding. Alexandra had inherited the gene from her grandmother, Queen Victoria, through whom hemophilia spread to several European royal houses. The doctors of the time were nearly powerless. Every episode of crisis turned into days of agonized waiting for the parents. And it is at this point of maximum vulnerability, in the autumn of 1905, that Rasputin is introduced to the imperial family. Notice the architecture of the moment. This is not a chance meeting at a ball. This is the meeting of a man who projects an impression of calm, almost hypnotic certainty with people who have spent months in a state of helpless, corrosive fear for the life of their only son. The psychology here is simple and all the more ruthless for it. A person in a state of chronic fear for someone they love is a person with their critical thinking filters nearly switched off. They do not need evidence. They need any certainty at all. And the one who offers that certainty first, especially in a calm, assured tone, receives a credit of trust that, under normal circumstances, would have taken years to earn. According to accounts from those close to the family, during one of Alexei's crises, Rasputin appeared at the boy's bedside, read prayers, and, whether through the simple fact of reducing the anxiety in the room or by happy coincidence with the natural course of the illness, the child's condition stabilized. For a desperate mother, this looked like a miracle. For us, 100 years later, it looks like a classic case of what modern psychology calls the placebo effect, layered over a desperate need to believe. It didn't matter what was actually happening in a medical sense. What mattered was that from that moment, Alexandra Fyodorovna was convinced her son's life literally depended on this man being near. Today, this same tactic looks considerably more mundane, but works by an identical mechanism. It is the coach who appears in your life a month after you lose your job, when you are least able to soberly evaluate someone else's promises. It is the partner who makes their decisive move on exactly the evening you have just come through a painful breakup and are least ready for critical analysis of their words. The entry point almost never coincides with the moment when you are at your strongest. Now begins the second tactic, and it is remarkably contemporary. Rasputin was never consistently available. He would appear at the palace, then vanish for weeks, disappearing to Siberia, dropping out of sight on debauches that generated scandalous rumors across all of St. Petersburg. This looks like a contradiction. Why would someone building influence behave so unreliably? In reality, it works in the opposite direction entirely. Constant presence devalues. Scarcity creates hunger. In the Petersburg salons of those years, a separate legend about Rasputin circulated, independent of the palace. Aristocratic women actively sought invitations to meet him. Rumors of his prophecies and spiritual counsel traveled by word of mouth, accumulating details with each retelling. And here, too, he behaved unpredictably. He could be pointedly rude to one petitioner and remarkably gentle with another, with no visible logic about who would receive which treatment on a given occasion. And that, too, amplified the effect. The unpredictability of his responses made people work far harder to earn his approval than any even reliably pleasant manner ever could have. Each of his returns to the palace after another disappearance was felt by Alexandra not as routine, but as relief, as the return of the one person capable of doing what no one else could. Modern psychologists studying manipulative and abusive relationships call this the withdrawal approach cycle. Unpredictability binds more tightly than stability because the human brain starts to experience every return as an emotional reward. Courtiers noted one more detail. Rasputin had a heavy, piercing gaze that many described as almost physically overwhelming. This may have been an innate quality, or it may have been a consciously refined instrument. Holding eye contact longer than is comfortable for the other person is one of the simplest and most effective ways to create a sense of someone else's dominance in a room without a single word spoken. You recognize this pattern in contemporary relationships. The person who responds to your messages sometimes instantly, sometimes goes silent for 3 days without explanation. The manager who one day draws you close, shares company secrets, then demonstrably cools without visible reason. In both cases, the logic is the same. Unpredictability holds the nervous system in a state of low-level anxious readiness, and any return of attention feels like relief so powerful it drowns out the question of whether you actually need these swings at all. By 1910 to 1911, a genuine coalition of enemies has formed around Rasputin. Parts of the clergy, parts of the aristocracy, even certain members of the imperial family itself, all openly warning Nicholas and Alexandra that this man was compromising the reputation of the monarchy. And here unfolds what is perhaps the most recognizable manipulative pattern of all. Any criticism directed at Rasputin was presented to the Empress not as a basis for checking the facts, but as a conspiracy against her son. People who tried to warn the imperial family lost access, positions, and influence, not because they were caught in a lie, but because the very act of criticism was received as betrayal. Among the most prominent figures caught in this mechanism were Bishop Hermogen and the monk Iliador, originally allies and patrons of Rasputin in his early years in the capital. When they later publicly turned against him, having become disillusioned with who he actually was, both paid for it with their standing in the church hierarchy. A telling detail: even those who had helped Rasputin enter high society became disposable the moment they tried to take back the credit of trust they had once extended. This is the classic isolation of a manipulation target from external sources of reality, what modern psychologists describe in the context of abusive relationships and destructive cults. The circle of trusted people around the person under influence gradually narrows to those who either support the manipulator or stay silent. Every dissenting voice is removed, not because the manipulator is omnipotent, but because the target herself voluntarily begins to protect the source of her emotional support from any threat. Among those who tried to open Nicholas's eyes was Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, one of the most powerful men in the empire, a person of enormous personal authority. Even he, after compiling a dossier on Rasputin's activities and personally presenting it to the emperor, achieved nothing beyond a temporary, formal dispatch of the elder on a pilgrimage, and very soon he was back at court. A system built around emotional dependence is extremely difficult to dismantle through rational argument, because it was never built on rationality. Contemporary isolation in toxic relationships or destructive workplaces looks the same. Not an outright prohibition on speaking to inconvenient people, but a slow devaluation. He's just jealous. She doesn't understand our situation. Those people never supported me. The manipulation target begins voluntarily to filter her own circle, keeping near her only those who do not question the main source of her emotional support. Here is the moment that distinguishes everyday manipulation from manipulation that changes the course of history. Once Rasputin had secured the status of indispensable in one narrow domain, the heir's health, he did not stop there. He began advising on ministerial appointments, on church affairs, on military matters. People who won his favor received patronage. Those who opposed him faced disgrace. The inflection point comes in 1915. Nicholas II decides to personally command the army at the fronts of the First World War and leaves the capital. The administration of the empire's internal affairs effectively passes to Alexandra, and Alexandra, by this point, has been under Rasputin's deep personal influence for several years. This is the tactic worth remembering separately from all the others. A manipulator rarely announces an expansion of authority openly. He uses the trust earned in one emotionally loaded domain, where you are most vulnerable, as permission to speak with authority about everything else. You trusted him with the life of your child, and without noticing, you begin to trust his opinion on the Minister of Finance. By accounts of contemporaries, numerous senior officials changed during this period. 4 prime ministers, several ministers of the interior, and a significant portion of these personnel decisions were associated by those who lived through it with Rasputin's influence or that of his immediate circle. One of the most frequently cited examples is the appointment of Boris Sturmer as chairman of the Council of Ministers in early 1916. Sturmer was distinguished by neither outstanding ability nor reputation among his fellow officials, but he enjoyed Rasputin's favor, and by numerous contemporary accounts, it was that favor which played the decisive role in his appointment to one of the empire's key posts in the middle of a war. In a corporate environment, the same tactic is instantly recognizable. The person brought in exclusively as a personal therapist or individual consultant to one executive quietly influences budgets, hiring, and company strategy a year later, while their formal title and authority have not changed by a single line. By 1916, Rasputin's name had become synonymous with corruption and decay at court, regardless of how accurate any specific accusation was. Rumors, frequently multiplied many times over, spread faster than any facts. Of drunken orgies in Petersburg restaurants, of petitioners paying for access in order to obtain a desired appointment or contract, of his personal power over the Empress reaching rumors so outlandish and unsupported that they say more about the state of the empire than about any documented truth. The press of the time, though constrained by censorship, seized on Rasputin's image as a symbol. Cartoonists drew him as a gigantic figure looming over the tiny throne of the emperor. By this point, it hardly mattered what was true and what was multiply retold gossip. The mere fact that such stories about a person in the Empress's immediate circle could circulate with impunity was already a diagnosis for trust in the monarchy. And here, the fifth and final tactic in this chain comes into view. The louder the accusations against Rasputin became, the tighter Alexandra held on to him, because for her, an attack on Rasputin was literally an attack on the health and life of her child. External pressure did not weaken the bond, it reinforced it. This is the classic defensive mechanism in which the manipulation target begins to perceive any attempt to sever the dependence not as help, but as a personal threat. It was this invulnerability to rational argument that ultimately left the aristocracy with no option other than physical removal, because every other means of severing the bond had failed. This is the moment in contemporary abusive relationships when friends and family throw up their hands. We showed her everything, all the evidence, and she only defends him more strongly. This is not stupidity and not weakness. It is a functioning psychological defense mechanism that, taken to its limit, works directly against the interests of the very person deploying it. Before we move to the end of this story, an important qualification, without which this breakdown would be dishonest. A significant portion of contemporary historians debate how real Rasputin's direct political power actually was, as opposed to the image that is formed in popular culture. A number of the personnel decisions that contemporaries attributed to him personally were most likely made by Alexandra independently or under the influence of other courtiers, with Rasputin serving as a convenient figure blamed after the fact by enemies of the monarchy who needed an intelligible symbol of power's decay. This does not invalidate the 5 tactics we have examined. The evidence of personal, emotional authority over Alexandra is documented far more reliably than the evidence of his direct political omnipotence. but it is an important reminder. Even the most famous stories about manipulators accumulate legend over time, transforming a real, imperfect person into something approaching a supernatural villain, which, by irony, serves the very image Rasputin himself cultivated during his lifetime. Keeping in mind this distinction between documented psychological influence and post-factum mythology about omnipotence is a useful habit when examining any story about manipulation, not just this one. There is one more layer of complexity here. A considerable portion of the scandalous rumors about Rasputin were deliberately amplified by his political opponents, the conservative faction of the aristocracy seeking to weaken the Tsar's household, and the liberal opposition that needed a convenient symbol of a rotting monarchy on the eve of a revolution being prepared. In other words, the myth of Rasputin turned out to be useful simultaneously to several competing forces, each of which inflated his influence in its own way, simply toward different ends. By the end of 1916, a group of conspirators, among them Prince Felix Yusupov, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, and several other representatives of the elite, decides to kill Rasputin, seeing in him the primary threat to the monarchy's reputation in the middle of a devastating war. On the night of December 29, 1916, Rasputin is lured to Yusupov's mansion on the Moika under the pretense of a friendly dinner. What follows is the scene with which we began this video. The poison that by legend did not work. The gunshots, the desperate attempt to flee across the courtyard, and finally, the icy water of the river. To be honest about the sources, the primary source for this dramatic version of events is Yusupov's own memoirs, written many years later in emigration. And the memoirs of a man recounting his own killing of someone are rarely an impartial source. The author has a direct interest in portraying the victim as maximally demonic and nearly supernatural, and himself as the hero who defeated a monster. Historians today treat the most theatrical details of that night, the version of the poison not working, for instance, with considerable skepticism for this reason. The body was found several days later. The autopsy, despite all the legends of superhuman endurance that had built up around that night, produced a far more prosaic picture. The cause of death was most likely one of the gunshot wounds, not drowning, as the most famous version of the myth would have it. But the conspirators miscalculated in the one thing that mattered. They expected that eliminating Rasputin would save the monarchy's reputation. In reality, it only dealt a final blow to the already fragile trust in the imperial family. The killing by courtiers of a man close to the Empress became a symbol of how thoroughly the system had rotted from within. Less than 3 months later, in February 1917, Nicholas II abdicated. A little over a year after that, the entire imperial family was executed by the Bolsheviks. Rasputin did not topple the monarchy, but the story of his influence became one of the symbols of the moral and institutional decay that made the empire's collapse nearly inevitable. Context matters here. The country had been fighting an exhausting world war for 3 years, suffering from inflation and food shortages, with the army taking devastating losses at the front. The Rasputin scandal alone could not have brought down an empire with centuries of history. But combined with these far more fundamental problems, it became the final drop that irreparably destroyed the belief among ordinary people and the elite alike that the monarchy was capable of governing the country with any rationality. Let us put it all together, because the point of this breakdown is not century-old gossip about a royal court, but the fact that each of these 5 tactics is working right now simply without crowned heads and without Siberia. The first, entry through someone else's crisis. The contemporary manipulator rarely appears in your life at a calm moment. They appear when you are going through a divorce, panicking over a health scare, in despair over your career, because that is when your critical filter is at its weakest. The practical takeaway is simple. Any important decision made in the first weeks after a serious crisis is worth checking twice. Not because you are foolish, but because at that moment your mind is physiologically worse at filtering risk. The second, managing availability. Inconsistent attention, sudden disappearances, and equally sudden returns. These are not coincidence and not busyness. They are a way of keeping you in permanent anticipation of their approval. Healthy relationships, professional or personal, are generally predictable. The unpredictability that makes you feel relief simply from the fact of someone's return is worth stopping to examine. Would that relief be this powerful if the person had simply behaved consistently from the beginning? The third, displacement of alternative voices. If a person in your life methodically devalues everyone who tries to warn you about them, that is not concern for your well-being. That is the removal of witnesses. A useful personal test. Count how many people you trusted a year ago who are still in your circle now. If the list is suspiciously short, and the common denominator of everyone who has dropped away is a single person, that is worth your attention. The fourth, expansion of the sphere of influence. Trust earned in one vulnerable area of your life gradually converts into a voice in all the others. An expert in one narrow domain is not automatically an expert in every other area of your life, even if they once saved you in that one. The fifth, invulnerability through attachment. When external criticism only strengthens your defense of the manipulator rather than prompting reflection, that is a signal that the decision has long since stopped being made rationally. This is the latest and most dangerous stage, because at this point, a person is usually convinced they are defending not the manipulator, but themselves against unfair attack. Rasputin's story is valuable precisely because it is documented at the highest level, in correspondence, diaries, memoirs of dozens of contemporaries. This is not an urban legend about manipulation. It is a protocol stretched across 10 years in which every step is visible. There is an uncomfortable truth in this story. Alexandra Fyodorovna was neither stupid nor weak. Contemporaries described her as intelligent, educated, genuinely devoted to her family. That is why this story matters. Manipulation on this scale does not work because the target is naive. It works because she is a human being, driven to the limit by the exact fear the manipulator zeroed in on. And that is the fundamental difference between today's breakdown and the usual checklists of advice about becoming invulnerable. There is no comic book villain here, and no perfect victim.
There is a mother who desperately wanted to save her son, and there is a man who, quite possibly, did not himself fully understand what he was doing, but year after year received power from it, and year after year took more. Perhaps the most unsettling conclusion from this entire story is that not one of the 5 mechanisms taken on its own looks like villainy. Being present in someone's difficult moment is not a crime. Occasionally disappearing and reappearing is something many people do without any malicious intent. Fiercely defending someone you trust from their critics could simply be called loyalty. That is why these tactics are so hard to recognize in the moment. Individually, each of them can be entirely innocent. The difference between care and manipulation is not visible in a single episode. It is visible in the accumulated pattern, in the direction the balance of your own autonomy has been gradually shifting while you were not looking. If, listening to these 5 tactics, you found yourself thinking of someone specific in your own life, a colleague, a partner, a mentor, that is not a reason for panic. It is a reason to look at the relationship a little more clearly, not through the lens of how indispensable this person seems, but through a simple question. What has been happening to your circle of people, to your confidence in yourself, and to your ability to hear other people's warnings while this person has been near? Write in the comments which of the 5 tactics you have encountered in real life. I am genuinely curious which of them is the most common. If this format, a real historical story alongside a breakdown of the psychology rather than invented lists of advice, resonates with you more than what is usually on this channel, hit like and subscribe. Next week, we will examine another historical manipulator whose story ends with a considerably less obvious conclusion. Rasputin's story ended with gunshots and icy water, but the mechanism he used outlived him and the empire he helped destroy. And that mechanism is still working now. Just without the holy man in the dirty shirt. Sometimes it is simply a person who knows exactly which moment you are at your most vulnerable.